Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew, and behind me you see my lovely assistant Calliope, who's apparently decided to join us for this video. It is Tuesday, and once again that means we are discussing challenges and problems that are specific to the pagan world. Now this one has a slightly broader context and principle, but I'm applying it more so to things that we are facing as pagans and as practitioners of the craft. But I'm also taking this as a problem that we can actually turn into a good thing, a lemonade out of lemon sort of thing. And that is, of course, dealing with the idea of limitations. Now, limitations is admittedly a word to which many pagans and witches have an allergic reaction. There's just no other way to put it. And if that's you, please stay with me. Don't panic. Just hear me out here. Now, one of the reasons for this reaction, and sometimes why it can be quite pronounced or very extreme, is because it's not all that unusual for pagans to come from a constrictive environment of some kind, whether this was within their childhood home or through previous religious training, or just circumstances in life they're faced with that have reduced their choices into such a manner that they felt absolutely suffocated by it. So, as a consequence, which is pretty natural, a number of our brothers and sisters have done their best to put as much distance between themselves and the very concept of limitations as what they possibly can. Sometimes there's also a fear that if you accept a limitation as existing, it will actually prevent you from really giving your all and fulfilling your potential, or that you'll be cut off from something that will be quite valuable for you. And that's the other fear, that limitations means that you are automatically losing out. There could be something fun or interesting or enlightening out there, and you don't get to do it because of a limitation. These concerns are very reasonable. I think these feelings are completely understandable, because the thing with limitations is that underneath all of these fears, I think we see that there is perhaps a greater fear of all, and that is the fear of stagnation, a fear of failure to fully become what you were meant to be, or a fear of not having a full understanding about important things that are going to impact you. So despite wanting to reject limitations, or at least try to resist the power of limitations, it is true that we still see limitations all around us. One limitation is our DNA. It dictates our height, skin tone, eye, hair color, amongst other things. DNA is something that limits our physical appearance, and while we can take means to adjust our appearance through plastic surgery or something as simple as dyeing our hair, it's not going to change what our DNA actually does. It simply is what it is, regardless of how we happen to feel about the results of it. Another limitation is to do with some subjects or skill sets will come more readily to us than others will. And by correlation, not everyone has the capability to become a doctor or an artist or a physicist, or to be a musician performing at Carnegie Hall at a really high level, or to be a mathematician or a psychologist, or to become a teacher or an orator. Different individuals will have different capacities for different things. And some things we will never be particularly good at, no matter how much we study and practice, and that is horrifically frustrating. Now, there is an old saying that says it takes all sorts to make a world. And through our observation, we can see that human beings are not interchangeable in terms of our abilities or our interests, and our capacities do limit what we're able to learn and achieve, as do our interest in it. Someone might be very good at math, but if they don't care about it, that doesn't mean they're going to grow up and become a professor of math at a university. Our interests also can be limiting, along with our natural capacities. But perhaps the most frightening limitations of all are of the magical and the spiritual variety. There is so much in the spiritual and the magical realms that we just do not understand. We have no information for. And we may never approach the greater, larger, overarching truth of a variety of things within our own lifetimes, or within lifetimes that are to come. In addition to that, which is already kind of frustrating. Not every skill in witchcraft is going to be particularly easy to learn, and there may be some that we struggle to even achieve competency in. For my own part, one of my shortcomings is scrying. If I ever feel competent at scrying, that will be a cause for great rejoicing, because thus far, all I can say about my efforts is that I mean well and try hard, but that doesn't mean I've been successful at it. Another thing to keep in mind is that not every practitioner has an equal amount of internal power and talent at their disposal, and I realize that this statement could be very controversial for some people. And I will also admit that just because we don't see our full potential and capabilities at the beginning doesn't mean we can't grow that like a muscle and become what we can be. But every muscle, even of the magical and spiritual variety, does have a limit. And over the years, I've encountered enough people who were prodigies and enough people who were struggling to master the basics, and then all the countless people who were in between those two extremes. I do think that it is self-evident that there are innate differences in magical capability. Not fun, not a popular view, but it is an honest reflection of what I happen to see. So, in view of this, I'm going to share some spiritual limitations that I have had to deal with firsthand. And this isn't about fishing for sympathy or anything nonsensical like that. This is simply to illustrate what sometimes occurs for people and then what they thereafter do about it and the after effects of it. So stick with me to see the final effects. The first thing I'd like to bring out is that gods and goddesses originating south of France and Germany appear to have no desire whatsoever to work with me, and our energies do not mesh well. This actually came up at last week's chat at the Brew. I was sharing that I had never really received a warm reception from any being associated with the Greek or the Roman pantheons. I did once manage to connect with Hecate, and that resulted in a polite but a firm refusal. I was summarily dismissed. I was not for her. And then I did have one encounter with Aphrodite, and her energy reminded me of the energy of every woman who I ever disliked. And I'm talking about that visceral reaction where you meet someone and you just dislike them on sight. And I shut that door as quickly as I could. I might describe it as popular mean girl energy. You know the sort I'm talking about. It's irritating enough when this comes from humans, and it's even more irritating that they think that if they did deign to like you or say anything nice, that you should take that as a compliment instead of the complete degradation that would be. But when it comes to deity, I'm really not looking for that kind of energy. I really do not want that kind of vibe, and if someone is so confrontational and hostile towards me from the word go, that is not a deity I want anything to do with. Another limitation that I've been dealing with, that I have dealt with in the past, is that the beings that are described as angels, whether we're talking within a Christian context or spirituality, that has some idea about angels outside of the Abrahamic tradition, those things play no role in my practices, and again, I don't really want them around. Now, several years back, I did go through an exploratory phase in which I was trying to interact with so-called angelic beings through meditation and divination. And part of my motivation of this was to see if I could separate the idea of angels from Christianity, if they would possibly have any meaning for me within my own pagan practices. The end result for me is that I always felt wrong. There was something that was distinctly incompatible between myself and these beings, and it just, every experience I ever had with them, it just wasn't right. I could connect at least a little bit, but I didn't like how it felt. I didn't think they particularly appreciated it either, and in the end, I just set the whole project aside and viewed it as a distraction from the direction that I actually needed to go spiritually. Now, on the magical front, I have experienced difficulties with healing magic. I have hopes that this will improve with time, especially since healing magic came to me fairly naturally at the beginning of my studies. But there's been a lot that's changed between then and now. I'm different, the world around me has changed a lot, And I've had some experiences within the past few years that have really tested me to a pretty excruciating degree, and that really ripped parts of myself down to the very bare bones. And as a consequence, is that all of this has left me feeling kind of raw in certain ways. I've become more hard-nosed and uncompromising in other ways, and in still other directions, I actually am in need of healing myself. So I'm working to undo that damage, and as I make progress with that, I suspect my capacity to be effective in healing magic and healing towards others will increase, but I am where I am right now. So, as I go through this process, I think it would be unreasonable to cling to the idea that I could provide assistance to other people that I cannot provide for myself. Uh, if we were to encounter, say, an ER doctor, and this doctor had been injured and they were bleeding, needed stitches, we would not expect that doctor in that moment to provide medical services to patients until the bleeding was stopped, until the stitches were dealt with, until they had recovered from that injury. Uh, in that circumstance, that doctor would have a limitation, a temporary limitation, but a limitation nonetheless. And it would be perfectly understandable for that doctor to say, hey, I'm in no fit state to treat patients. No one would hold that against the doctor. And in fact, the doctor, while bleeding and everything else, could actually do more damage to the patients than good if they were to say, oh, I can just tough it out. So likewise, as I'm going through my own healing process, and as other people are going through theirs, we shouldn't beat ourselves up for not being 100%. We shouldn't be frustrated with ourselves for if someone's coming to us for help saying, I'm just in no fit state. I can recommend someone else who can probably be of assistance to you, or here are some ideas that you might try to help yourself. But right now, I'm just not in that proper place. We're not bleeding onto them, physically. But certainly, if we are dealing with issues, we do not want to transfer those issues on the energetic level. Just something to keep in mind if anyone watching this is dealing with similar issues. This brings us to our last idea of how, when we discover our limitations, this can actually help us move forward. Because up until now, we've really talked about the downsides of limitations, the psychological paralysis that limitations can become, the frustrating aspects of limitations of ourselves when we experience them. But how can the limitation ever actually turn out to be a good thing? So on this note, first I would like to acknowledge that sometimes within paganism, the impression can be given that in order to have a full, rich, meaningful spiritual life, it will require a person to accumulate enough knowledge that they would be the equivalent to a professor of natural and revealed religion and comparative theology. I 100% support study, education, and spiritual exploration, and I do not want this to be taken as an encouragement for people not to go to that effort, because we should. We should. However, what is the purpose for our studies? What is the purpose for the skills that we practice? What is the purpose for our attempts to connect with the divine? This is about getting something out of it. We're not just studying to accumulate the knowledge, and we certainly should not be studying in hopes of impressing other people. This should be about what is helping us make those genuine connections. And the truth is, not every spiritual idea or magical practice that's ever existed will ultimately prove relevant to our own path. So I suppose the point is that we shouldn't lose sight of the purpose. We're pursuing knowledge to forge, maintain, and grow spiritual connections and magical capabilities. And if something is falling outside of that, it might be intellectually interesting, but maybe that's not what we always need to focus upon, especially if we're going through a rougher patch spiritually and we're needing to really hardcore hit the areas that are actually going to be helping us be propelled forward. Something to think about. Now, next, if we should discover that working with a particular pantheon or certain ideas or practices just aren't in the cards for us, it can actually be incredibly freeing. Just think about it. This is, let's say it's one thing, but that one thing is off your plate. And you can focus on the other things that are actually on your plate that will actually matter to you and actually be helpful to you. So, like for me, because I have discovered that the Greco-Roman pantheon has no wish to deal with me, and because I do not feel connections to pantheons and beings outside of the Celts and the Nordic and Germanic spheres, that means I have tons of brain space completely freed up. I don't have to absorb the spiritual experiences of the entire world now. All I have to do is learn about the mysteries of Wicca, the Celtic and Nordic/Germanic pantheons, their culture, philosophy, the traditions of Western magic, and the spirits living on the land where I also live. By comparison, this, with, as opposed to the entire world, I feel like I'm on vacation. It really is that much of a weight lifted off of my shoulders. Now, lastly, I want to talk about when our limitations are of a temporary nature or that there's a little bit more flexibility. This is actually a challenge for growth. Now, just because something isn't easy for us doesn't mean that it isn't worth doing. If we work on our spiritual and our magical weaknesses, it makes us more complete as a practitioner. So even if we don't attain that level of excellence that we want, it's still beneficial to strive for competence, because competence quite often is enough to get the job done. But if we have an inability, that ensures that we can't. So competence, and then if we feel like we have the ability to move beyond that competence, that's the point when we can strive to excellence. And also, when we do take our skills or our knowledge up a level, we can really be proud of our efforts. And we're reaping the rewards and we can enjoy the results of all of that. It also boosts our confidence and it makes it much more likely that we'll take on future challenges with gusto and fortitude. Now, the last thing I'd like to bring up on this subject for this video is to remember the lesson of the Fool in the tarot. Now, in the tarot, the Fool represents, amongst other things, raw potential. All the possibilities that could ever exist. It is no limits, no boundaries of any kind. But it isn't until the Fool leaps or he falls off of his cliff that he's teetering on the edge of, and then begins to make choices that the Fool can truly take shape and become. And we too, we have to make choices and even accept limitations in order to become who and what we have potential to be. It is the choice, it is the limitation that leads to the becoming and truly taking shape. So, just a few things to think about. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. We have our Discord group called Blackbird's Brew. There'll be a link to join in the description box below. And I think that's it for right now. See you in another video. Bye.